Welcome to Chapter 9 of The Divide. Please like and subscribe. The bell had rung and school was about to begin. Julia had entered her classroom a few minutes earlier. She didn't look up at Clarice or anyone else. She simply went in and found her name on her desk and sat down. Julia's desk was at the front of the class, at the far left side of the room, next to the window and facing the teacher. Sitting next to her on her right was Clarice's friend, the one who may or may not have dropped soap on the stairs. Julia looked over to see her name, which was written on a sticker on the table. Her name read Yolanda. "Good morning, everyone," came an old lady's voice from the back of the class. Julia turned around to see her teacher. She was a short, pudgy, old black lady with a patch over one eye. She had angry old battle-axe energy. Julia immediately liked her. "Many of you know I am Miss Myrtle," she announced as she wobbled her way to the front of the class. "Or Miss Crank, Miss Scrooge, Miss Old as Dirt One-Eyed Monster, or whatever else you kids call me behind my back. Just so you know, call me what you want when I'm not listening. But when you're talking to my face, you better show respect. Is that clear?" She asked this with a tone of absolute dominance. And the immediate answer from the students made it very clear they understood her perfectly. "Yes, Miss Myrtle," the entire class replied in unison. "So," she continued, "you little princes and princesses are in grade 10 now. Getting older, getting ready for the world to come, which it will, very soon. And my job is to slap the silly out of you and wake you up. But before we start, Julia, you're new here." "Yes, Miss Myrtle," Julia replied, slightly nervous as she wasn't expecting to be addressed. "Well," Miss Myrtle continued, "you get treated like the rest. I don't care how many times you've been shot. You got it?" Before Julia could respond, a few light chuckles were heard throughout the class. "I wouldn't have it any other way," Julia answered. Miss Myrtle then took a moment to walk over to Julia and lean in close to look at her with her one good eye. She mumbled upon inspection. She then rose up again to look at the rest of the class. "So, let's start with history. The rise and fall of empires, shall we? Notebooks out, and keep your fingers out your nose and your stinky buttholes closed." Everyone tried not to laugh as they took out their notebooks and pencils. For the next hour, Miss Myrtle gave a lecture like no other Julia had ever heard. Miss Myrtle was insightful, emotional, raw, and real. This was the type of teaching that Julia heard of. This was the reason why she wanted to come to Eminence. By the end of the lecture, Miss Myrtle went around the room asking questions and tapping children on their forehead or even kicking their chair for answers. It was a forceful style, yet still playful. Eventually, Julia received a light kick in the back of her chair. "All right, let's see what you got," started off Miss Myrtle. "Julia, tell us all how much bloodshed is worth true freedom. And don't bother looking in the book. This is coming straight from you." Julia did not hesitate to answer. "That's simple, Miss Myrtle. All the blood in the world." When she replied, the only thought in her head was that of the awful man who shot her. "Good," replied Miss Myrtle with interest in her voice. "But what exactly is true freedom? If we are to sacrifice everything and all for it, can you define it?" Julia thought for a second and was going to answer when Clarice spoke out from the back of the class. "True freedom is in the structure, and the structure is what makes up true freedom. The duality or flexing in a civilization is needed for its survival, and therefore all must fight and shed blood to protect that freedom." "Excellent," replied Miss Myrtle. "Too bad no one asked you. Julia, what is true freedom to you?" "I agree with Clarice," Julia said. "But in order to define true freedom, we also must define true structure. And we must agree that the structure is beneficial and gives enough freedom. The duality or flex, as Clara says, must be more divine than man-made, or why just die for one man's idea when another will take his place?" Miss Myrtle leaned in again and looked at Julia with her one good eye. Then she smiled. "Now that's an answer." As Julia was being blown away by the amazing old battle axe that is Miss Myrtle, Matthew was sitting in a classroom filled with silence. All the students quietly perched in their chairs, anxious as their teacher stared at them from the front of the room. He was a short, square-headed-looking man with glasses and a blonde buzz cut. He almost looked as if a person morphed into a giant eraser. Matthew looked at him and immediately had thoughts. He definitely has no girlfriend. Probably doesn't even have friends either. Usually Matty's wit gets the best of him and he would have blurted that out, but not today. Matty thought. I don't want to make enemies out of him just yet. But what would be the best nickname for this guy? Let me wait to hear his name first. And eventually, what seemed like an eternity, the teacher finally stopped staring and started to speak. He spoke in a deep and cocky tone. "Hello. My name is Mr. Minx, and you are all my students." Matthew's lips pressed together as not to laugh, while his eyes got big and shiny from what he was thinking. "Mr. Minx? What is he, like a male stripper?" "I'm Mr. Minx. I'll dance for $1. Matthew joked inside of his head. He then covered his mouth with his hand so as not to laugh. "Okay," Matty thought, trying to calm himself down. "Let's get serious. What's the nickname? What's the name?" This went on in Matty's head for the next 10 minutes or so, as Mr. Minx explained the class rules and expectations of each student. Minx? Square head. Minecraft Minx? No. Oh, Sphinx, that rhymes with Minx. Minx the Sphinx. Lame. Matty's face was frustrated as he couldn't think of an insulting nickname for Mr. Minx. Suddenly, a loud thud on his desk awoke him from his mental maze of possible insults. Matthew looked up to see a giant math book on his desk and Mr. Minx hovering over him. "So, we have a new student at the school," spoke Mr. Minx. "But not the hero. No, that is your sister. You are the one who needed a hero, I see. Well, Mr. Crane, is it? We will start with a pop quiz, geometry. Let's see how you do without a savior, shall we?" Matthew looked at Mr. Minx a bit perplexed. Technically, he is right, Matty thought. I'm not the hero, and I did need one. It still seems kind of like an insult, though. Julia would hate it if I got in trouble on day one. I best let it go for now. "Thank you, Mr. Schminx?" No, that doesn't work. "Thank you, Mr. Minx," replied Matthew. "I'll try my best." "See that you do, and no cheating." Mr. Minx then leaned in close to Matthew. "I'll be watching you, Mr. Crane." Matthew smiled and leaned forward to reply in a whisper. "That sounds creepy." "And bring the test on." Mr. Minx chuckled as he stood up and walked back to the front of the class. He then announced, "Open your textbooks. Page 97 to 100. 30 minutes, no talking." The test began. Mr. Minx walked around the room, wearily humming opera as he went. Matthew sat dead center in the room with Hans looming over from the seat behind him. 10 minutes in, Mr. Minx walked by Maddie's desk and abruptly stopped humming. Matthew was doodling on the back page of the textbook. "You are doodling," he said with a fierceness in his tone. "And pictures of, what is this? Handsome Minecraft character dancing in rain of dollar bills? Very strange indeed, Mr. Crane. You are telling me that you have given up already? Eminence is no place for—" Matthew interrupted Mr. Minx by holding up his hand. Then with his other hand he opened his textbook to page 97 to 100. For the next minute or so, Mr. Minx ravenously looked through Matthew's work. And as each second ticked by, his face grew more and more shocked. "Not one mistake," he whispered. "Why, that's sufficient," he said as he caught himself from getting too overly surprised. "Well, no more doodling, and no more strange doodling at that." "No problem," replied Matthew with a sense of pride in his voice. "May I go to the bathroom, sir?" Mr. Minx, still looking down at Matthew's textbook, perplexed at his work, spoke on autopilot and agreed as he waved Matthew to leave quietly to the restroom. Matthew left the room without even realizing. He had no idea where the bathroom was. He thought with a slight sense of adventure. I guess I'll have to peruse around and find it. Maddie turned left and walked down the corridor, observing the school as he went. Immediately he noticed something off, something he never saw in the public school he attended. In between every classroom was an unmarked metal door. No label, no windows to look inside, just a small sensor to the right of the handle for a key card to open. "That looks like some heavy-duty metal on those doors," Matthew thought. Continuing his walk, he poked his head into the windows of every classroom. Each teacher he saw teaching had a very similar style and look to them. Maddie couldn't quite label it. However, it was like they all taught with an urgency, with a hardness, and with a slight crooked stick up their butt. And interesting to note, within 1 second of Matthew peeking in their room, each teacher immediately spotted him with caution in their eyes. "Sheesh," Maddie said to himself. "These teachers got eyes of hawks." Towards the end of the hallway, he passed a wide opening to a staircase on the right, and then he found the bathroom just behind it. After using the restroom, Maddie felt it was time to end his adventure and go back to class. That was until he heard something from the staircase. It was coming from below. It wasn't pleasant. It seemed like the faint sound of someone in agony. Maddie slowly stepped towards the stairs which led down to the lower level. Who would be screaming, he thought. He felt a surge of curiosity pushing him to go down the stairs, one that almost overtook him until a giant shadow covered him from behind. Matthew turned around. Hans was standing behind him. There was an awkward moment where they both stared at each other as the faintest sound of screaming came from below. Hans's eyes slowly moved from Maddie towards the staircase going down, then back to Maddie. Pointing towards the classroom, Hans spoke in his serious tone. "Go." "Sure thing," Matthew replied with hesitation. "You don't hear that, though?" he asked before moving. Hans took another moment to peer down the stairs, then back to Matthew. "Go," he said.